It was a cold, heavy morning at Richmond Palace, and all around her the world seemed to slow. Elizabeth I, the last of the Tudors, lay propped up on silk pillows, her fingers draped limply across the brocade covers. The candles in the chamber flickered low, their glow barely brushing the painted woodwork and the faces of those gathered, silent as the grave. You could almost hear the whisper of their breathing, each waiting, holding themselves still for the Queen to speak, to move, to show a sign that she was still very much alive. But she did not. Elizabeth had ruled for over 40 years. A lifetime of power and pageantry, and now she was small, almost swallowed by the bed. The once vibrant woman who had danced, laughed, and outsmarted more men than she could count was now still. You might think the weight of a crown is just a metaphor, but no, it's heavier than a stone, heavier than guilt, heavier than regret. And at this moment it seemed to press her deeper into the mattress. Her courtiers' old, familiar faces like Robert Cecil, the Earl of Nottingham, and the Archbishop of Canterbury hovered nearby, trading glances, their lips tight, their bodies tense as if afraid that even a whisper might pull her into the shadows for good. The air in the room was thick, and somewhere in the distance a clock chimed, its slow, mournful tone cutting through the hush. Time was slipping away, minute by minute, breath by breath. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's decline had truly begun weeks or even months before, or whether it was the weight of a single brutal winter that finally wore her down. Either way, by March of 1603, she was not the woman England had known. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And by the way, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is over there, so drop a comment below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Her skin, once powdered to porcelain, now looked waxy and pale. Her eyes, once bright and calculating, stared ahead, unfocused, distant. It was said she sat in a corner for hours on end, refusing to eat, refusing to sleep, refusing to lie down at all. She simply sat, wrapped in silence, as if listening to some whisper only she could hear. One observer, a courtier named Sir John Harrington, wrote in a letter that her mood was strangely dark. He hinted that she muttered to herself that she refused her doctor's remedies, and that when they suggested she rest, she merely shook her head. And here's the kicker. People in the court thought she might have simply decided to die, not by any dagger or poison, but by sheer willpower, like she could command her heart to stop the way she had commanded armies. It sounds absurd, but, well, when you've lived your life as a queen, who's dodged death at every turn, who's outmaneuvered plots, and who's been told since childhood that you were chosen by God, maybe it doesn't seem so far-fetched. As the day wore on, the room grew colder, as if the walls themselves were drawing back in fear. The courtiers watched. The maids flinched at every cough, and outside the bells in London rang, each toll stretching long into the dusk. There was an eerie sense that something or someone was waiting just out of sight. Her chamber, once filled with the sound of laughter and music, now lay wrapped in a thick, heavy quiet. Shadows crept across the walls, chasing the candlelight, turning the carved ceilings into a slow-moving sea of shapes. The tall windows were shuttered tight, as if even the pale sunlight might disturb her. And yet, for all that stillness, the room seemed to pulse, to breathe, like it held its breath along with the queen. Her bed, a great structure of dark wood and embroidered velvet, looked almost like a throne now, though no crown rested on her head. She wore no jewels, no coronet, no stiff ruffs or silks, just a plain linen nightgown, soft and warm, the kind you wouldn't imagine for a queen. But then again, death doesn't care for pageantry. A handful of courtiers stood at a respectful distance. Robert Cecil, the ever-watchful spymaster, the aged Archbishop of Canterbury, his hands folded in prayer. The ladies of her bedchamber, their eyes red from crying. Each one seemed to drift in and out, their faces pale in the dim light, watching, waiting, wondering when the moment would come. You could almost hear the creak of their shoes on the floorboards, the soft brush of skirts, the whispered prayers that didn't seem to rise past the rafters. And then there was the silence, that deep, aching, ringing silence, the kind that fills your ears when you're waiting for bad news, or maybe when you know the bad news is already here, and you're just pretending it isn't. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth was truly aware of those around her in those final hours. Some say she drifted in and out of sleep, her breathing ragged but steady. Others suggest she was fully alert, refusing to speak, her lips pressed tight, her eyes darting from face to face like she was searching for someone or something. And here's a quirky little detail. It's said that in those last days, Elizabeth refused to let anyone move her bed. It sounds small, doesn't it? But in the superstitions of the time, it was believed that shifting the bed meant acknowledging death was near, and Elizabeth, stubborn to the end, wouldn't have it. So the bed stayed put, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how restless she became. You can almost picture it, this grand, immovable bed, surrounded by hushed figures, the heavy curtains drawn, the scent of beeswax and herbs in the air, and the queen herself silent, unmoving, a breath away from eternity. The chamber darkened as evening crept in, the flickering candles casting long, thin shadows across the bed. Somewhere in the distance, the palace dogs barked once, sharp and sudden, before falling back into silence. The fire crackled low, sending the occasional pop into the stillness, but it couldn't quite push back the chill. The watchers huddled close, their voices hushed, their hands clasped together like school children, waiting for a lesson that might never come. And every so often one of them would glance at the queen, half expecting her to open her eyes and demand a report on the Spanish threat, or perhaps a fresh tankard of ale. But she did not. And that's the thing about death. It doesn't always look the way you expect. It's not always dramatic with thunderclaps and shouts. Sometimes it's just a quiet room, a soft creak of the floor, and a lingering question that no one dares to ask. The ring, yes, the ring. There's something about a tiny object holding such an enormous story, isn't there? On Elizabeth's frail finger rested a small gold locket ring, worn smooth from years of use. It was delicate, barely the size of a thumbnail, but it held within it a secret that had followed her to her final breath. This wasn't just any ring, it was a locket, and inside, hidden beneath a miniature painting, were two faces, Elizabeth's own portrait, and that of her mother, Anne Boleyn. Now that's a bit of a family keepsake, don't you think? The mother who had been executed when Elizabeth was just 2.5 years old, and the daughter who would grow up to become the most powerful woman in England. It's said that Elizabeth never let the ring out of her sight, that she wore it always, almost as if it anchored her to the past, a quiet reminder of the bloodline she carried and the shadow of the axe that had once fallen on her family. And when she passed, the ring had to be carefully pried from her finger, the skin beneath it pale and pressed flat. Did the courtiers who found it see it as a symbol of her private grief, or was it just a bit of jewelry they tucked away among her things? Either way, it adds a strange, intimate layer to her story, doesn't it? That even as she ruled over kingdoms, she carried a piece of her mother's memory against her skin, all the way to the end. There's an almost eerie weight to that image, this queen, untouchable and mighty, clinging quietly to a mother she could barely remember, a mother who had been branded a traitor and a whore by the same court that now knelt at Elizabeth's bedside. And then there's the curious detail of how the ring might have been a hidden message. Some scholars think it was a subtle declaration, a kind of private rebellion. After all, Anne Boleyn had been executed under the accusation of treason, and yet here was Elizabeth, the living proof that her mother's bloodline still ruled the throne. It makes you wonder, did she ever twist the ring on her finger during tense moments of court politics? Did she glance down at it while hearing petitions from noblemen, or during long, lonely nights when the weight of the crown felt like a vice on her head? One story suggests that in her final days, Elizabeth would sit for hours, turning the ring slowly, as if the smooth metal and tiny portraits were the last tangible connection she had to a life before the throne. That quiet, repetitive motion, twist, pause, twist again, it paints a picture of a woman not just dying, but looking back across the years, across the choices she had made, and maybe even the things she had lost. And you know, it's kind of wild to think that in the end, the most powerful woman in England, maybe even the world at that time, was still just a daughter missing her mother. The shadows in the room lengthened. The air, heavy with candle smoke, seemed to press down on the watchers like a blanket. And through it all, the tiny gold ring gleamed faintly in the dim light, its secret faces hidden from view, holding its own small piece of the queen's heart. The last meal of a queen. You'd think it would be a grand affair, right? A lavish spread of roasted meats, spiced fruits, and silver goblets brimming with wine. But no. In Elizabeth's final days, food was not a comfort, not a joy. If anything, it was an afterthought. Historians still argue whether she ate much of anything at all in her last weeks. Some say she nibbled on a little broth. Others whisper she took only a few sips of water and the occasional piece of bread. And here's the strange thing. There's a story, half truth and half legend, that a dish of stewed prunes was brought to her bedside. Prunes. Not exactly a royal banquet, but hey, when you're 69 years old, you take what you can get. It's said that the prunes were offered by her devoted ladies-in-waiting, those women who had been by her side through years of triumphs and heartbreaks. They hoped the soft fruit would tempt her. After all, even the most powerful queens need to eat. But Elizabeth, pale and silent, simply turned her head away, a refusal so quiet yet so final. And here's where the quirky details sneak in. There was a belief at the time that certain foods could affect the humors of the body. Prunes were thought to calm melancholy, to soothe the digestion. So it wasn't just a snack, it was, in their minds, a little potion of comfort, a chance to ease her suffering. But alas, the prunes sat untouched, growing cold as the air in the chamber thickened. Some whispered that she was poisoned, that perhaps someone had tampered with her food. That old fear, that old paranoia, poison in the cup, poison in the plate, still haunted the royal court. And when a queen refuses food, well, the whispers grow louder, don't they? Who brought it to her? Was it safe? Was there something in it? But more likely, it was her grief and her body that betrayed her. Elizabeth had been through so much: wars, plots, betrayals. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, years earlier had weighed heavily on her. And then there was the death of her beloved Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, a man who had once been like a son or maybe something more. That loss seemed to hollow her out, and food became an afterthought, a duty she could no longer summon the energy for. It's not hard to imagine her sitting there in the darkening chamber, the prunes cooling on a silver dish, the candlelight flickering against the carved wood, and the soft shuffling of slippers as her ladies tried, again and again, to coax her into eating. Maybe they whispered to her, pleaded, begged with quiet, desperate voices, but Elizabeth, stubborn as ever, simply would not. The great irony, of course, is that this was a woman who had ruled with iron will, who had outlasted plots and rebellions, who had survived smallpox, heartbreak, and political storms, and yet here she was, refusing the simple, life-sustaining act of eating. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. A dog barked in the distance, and in that small, dim chamber, a silver dish of stewed prunes sat untouched, growing colder by the hour. Her body was betraying her, bit by bit. Aches that never faded, a constant heaviness in her chest, a bone-deep weariness that sleep couldn't fix if she even slept at all. Elizabeth, once the fiery queen who had danced in her younger years, who had charmed ambassadors and toyed with the hearts of noblemen, now seemed like a flickering candle, burning low, her flame struggling to hold on. And there was pain, a sharp, knowing kind that seemed to curl into her bones and make her wince when no one was supposed to notice. Her ladies, loyal to the last, tried to help. They massaged her limbs, rubbed oils on her chest, whispered prayers over her body, but nothing seemed to work. Historians still argue whether she suffered from something we'd recognize today, a form of cancer, perhaps, or a failing heart, or maybe even pneumonia after a long, damp winter. There's no clear answer. In those days, there were no scans or blood tests. No way to peer inside the body and understand what was breaking down. And so her decline remained a puzzle, both to the people who watched over her and to those who study her today. But here's a strange little tidbit. Elizabeth was known for her aversion to medicine. She didn't trust doctors much, probably with good reason, considering the treatments of the time. Bleeding, purging, cupping, all those charming medieval tortures that often did more harm than good. And so, as her body failed her, she may have resisted their help, preferring to suffer in silence rather than risk their cures. Her skin, once powdered and painted to a near-perfect white, grew sallow, almost waxen. Her famous red hair, a symbol of her fiery spirit, had long since faded to a pale, thin wisp, hidden beneath wigs and heavy jewels. Her hands, once so steady as she signed royal decrees, trembled when she tried to lift them. And yet she still held herself with that regal air. Imagine it, a woman who could barely rise from her chair, still straightening her back, still narrowing her eyes in that piercing, shrewd gaze, as if daring death itself to come closer. That's the thing about Elizabeth, she didn't go quietly. It's said that when her courtiers suggested she lie down and rest, she refused, again and again. Some say it was because she believed if she laid down, she would never get back up. Others suggest it was pure stubbornness, that legendary Tudor that had kept her alive through political storms and personal heartbreaks. The room grew colder with each passing day, the air damp and heavy. The fires crackled low, but the warmth didn't seem to reach her anymore. Outside, spring was trying to bloom daffodils pushing through the earth, birds singing in the trees, but inside that dark chamber, it was as if the seasons had stopped, holding their breath with the rest of the world, waiting for a queen to exhale her last. And all the while, the pain gnawed at her, relentless and unseen. The courtiers didn't speak of it, not aloud, but their eyes said enough. They watched her thin frame, the slow, labored breathing, the way she seemed to fade like a portrait left in the sun. And maybe in their hearts they knew. They knew they were watching the end of an era, even if they couldn't say it out loud. The whispers of madness crept through the halls like an unwelcome draft. Some said the queen had lost her mind, that she mumbled to herself, eyes darting toward the dark corners of the chamber where no one else could see a thing. Others said she wept in silence, tears slipping down her cheeks as if mourning some great unseen loss. Grief weighed on Elizabeth like a velvet cloak, heavy and suffocating. She had buried friends, lovers, rivals most recently. The execution of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, hung over her like a dark cloud. The man she had once adored, whom she had elevated, only to order his death when he betrayed her. That kind of regret doesn't fade easily. It sticks, sharp and raw, cutting into every quiet moment. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's mental state in those final weeks was one of true madness, or just the exhaustion of a woman who had ruled too long, fought too hard, and lost too many. Some say she slipped into a kind of melancholy fugue, refusing food, refusing sleep, and eventually refusing to speak. Others insist she was lucid, perhaps even defiant to the end. It's one of those deliciously murky debates that makes you wish for a time machine and a front row seat in her chamber. Here's a quirky little footnote for you. Elizabeth believed in the power of symbols. She had her astrologers, her charms, her lucky tokens. There's a tale that she had a particular gemstone, a sapphire, perhaps that she kept close in her final days, turning it over in her fingers like a talisman against the darkness. Did she think it would protect her from death? Or was it just another of the small comforts she clung to, like the locket ring with her mother's face? We'll never know for sure. Her court, once bustling with noise and intrigue, was now subdued, the usual chatter and bustle replaced by hushed voices and quick glances. Courtiers paced the corridors, wondering when the end would come, while others lingered near the chamber door, waiting for any news. And inside, Elizabeth sat sometimes staring blankly into the fire, sometimes refusing to speak at all. And there's this strange, haunting detail. She wouldn't go to bed. For days on end, she sat upright in a chair or propped up on pillows, refusing to lie down. It was as if she believed that lying down meant surrender, and surrender was not in her nature. She had survived smallpox, assassination plots, and even the Spanish Armada. Why should she give in now? Yet her body told a different story. Her breath grew shallow. Her skin, pale as parchment, seemed to stretch too tightly over her bones. Her hands, once so steady as she signed royal proclamations, trembled when they lifted to touch her cheek or stroke that sapphire between her fingers. And through it all, the room darkened. The candles burned lower. The faces around her blurred, and maybe, just maybe, Elizabeth began to see things no one else could. Maybe she saw the ghosts of those she had loved and lost. Maybe she saw her mother's face, or Essex's pleading eyes, or even the shadow of death itself waiting in the corner. You can almost hear the quiet rustle of fabric as her ladies watched, hearts breaking but faces still, whispering prayers that may or may not have reached her ears. The chamber seemed to shrink around her, the air thick and still, as if time itself had slowed, waiting for the queen to decide whether to fight or finally, after all those years, to let go. The ritual of sitting up, it sounds so simple, so harmless, but for Elizabeth, it became an eerie, defiant standoff with death itself. For days on end, she refused to lie down. The bed loomed in the middle of the chamber, an enormous thing with its heavy canopy and dark wood, but she wouldn't give in to it. She sat in her chair, or propped up by pillows, stubbornly upright, as if to lie down would be an admission, a silent contract signed with the Grim Reaper. It wasn't just stubbornness, Dot, in those days. There was a deep-rooted superstition that lying down was a step toward dying. To rest your head on the pillow was to invite the end, to say to the world, "I'm ready." Elizabeth? Oh, no. She wasn't ready. Even as her breath grew shallow, her body frail, her skin ashen, she clung to that last sliver of control. She had ruled England through wars, rebellions, and the constant threat of invasion. Why stop now? Her ladies-in-waiting pleaded with her, quietly, gently. "Your Majesty, please lie down, rest." They brought soft blankets, fluffed the pillows, tried to coax her into comfort. But Elizabeth would shake her head, a small, tight motion that said everything. No, Dot, not yet. Historians still argue whether this refusal was a matter of pride or fear. Did she think that if she lay down, she'd never rise again? Or was it the simple refusal of a woman who had been told all her life that she was chosen by God, that she alone was England's hope and future, and that her duty was to endure? There's a quirky detail that always stands out in this part of the story. Elizabeth sat surrounded by cushions, so many that it must have looked almost absurd, like she was building a fort against death itself. Bolsters behind her back, pillows propped under her arms, even soft footstools at her feet, but no bed. The bed, that symbol of surrender, remained untouched, an island she refused to set foot on. And through it all, the room remained heavy with the quiet sounds of a life slowly ebbing. The crackle of the fire, the soft weeping of a maid who had known the queen since her youth, the occasional shuffle of a courtier shifting awkwardly as they waited and waited and waited. Imagine the scene. Elizabeth, gaunt and pale, her eyelids drooping but her spine stubbornly straight, sitting as if she were still on her throne. Her face drawn, her fingers clutching at the fabric of her gown, the room full of anxious whispers and unspoken dread. One observer later wrote that she sat there for many days and nights, a phrase that drips with the weight of time stretched thin. Can you picture it? The flickering candlelight casting shadows that seemed to grow longer and darker, the clock in the corner ticking away each second like a drum beat, and the queen refusing the final act of lying down. But time waits for no one, not even a queen. Her breaths grew shallower, her hands colder, and the strength that had carried her through so many storms began to drain away. Still, she sat, and as the hours dragged on, those around her began to wonder, how long can someone stay awake, stay upright, before the body simply can't go on? That question lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken, as Elizabeth stared into the fire, her gaze fixed on something no one else could see. The whispers of poison, they floated like smoke through the palace corridors, curling into ears, slipping through keyholes, a cold, slithering thought that maybe, just maybe, Elizabeth hadn't died by nature's hand. After all, this was a queen who had made enemies in every corner of Europe. Spain, France, even within her own court, there were always those who watched, waited, and plotted. Could it have been poison? Historians still argue whether the rumors held any truth, or if they were just the frightened imaginings of a court not ready to face the end of an era. There was no proof, of course, no neat little vial tucked away under a pillow, no strange discoloration of the skin that would scream foul play. One tale tells of a dish, maybe of broth, maybe a posset brought to Elizabeth's bedside by a trusted servant. The queen barely touched it, but the idea lingered. Was it safe? Had someone slipped something into her food or drink? After all, the Tudors were no strangers to the art of quiet assassination. Poison was the weapon of choice for those who preferred whispers to daggers, and Elizabeth had lived long enough to know how deadly a well-placed drop could be. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. There was an old belief in the court that certain powders could be mixed into food or drink without altering taste, things like arsenic, or even powdered toadstool. It sounds like a plot from a Gothic novel, but it's not so far-fetched when you consider how many monarchs had fallen to mysterious illnesses over the centuries. Just quiet suspicion, unspoken looks, the odd sideways glance from one courtier to another. Maybe it was fear. Maybe no one wanted to believe that such a thing could happen under their very noses. Or maybe deep down they knew that death had simply come for the queen at last, and no poison had been necessary. Elizabeth had outlived so many enemies. The Pope had once excommunicated her. The Spanish Armada had tried and failed to topple her. Plots like the Babington conspiracy and the Ridolfi plot had threatened her life. And now, as her breath grew shallow and her pulse faded, there were still those who might have wished for her end. But the truth? It's maddeningly slippery. Historians still debate whether her death was purely natural or whether there were darker hands at work. We'll never know for certain. And maybe, just maybe, Elizabeth herself wondered. Did she lie awake in those final days, turning over the faces of her court in her mind, wondering who among them might have wanted her gone? Did she trust them? Or had the years of political intrigue left her suspicious of even the closest faces? The candles burned low. The room smelled of beeswax and damp wool, and outside the bells of London tolled softly, marking the hours of a world still turning, even as its queen began to slip away. The whispers of poison would fade, but never fully vanish, like a shadow in the corner of the room. Enemies, real and imagined, had always lurked around Elizabeth, even in her final hours. The court, once bustling with eager faces and clever tongues, had grown cautious, almost fearful, as the queen lingered in that strange in-between place. After all, when the monarch teeters on the edge of life and death, so does the future of the kingdom. Outside the palace, the air of uncertainty was thick. Spain still lingered in the minds of the English, yes, The Armada had been defeated years before, but Philip III wasn't exactly sending Elizabeth a fruit basket. The French? They were always unpredictable. And the Irish ... Well, the 9 Years' War had only recently ended, and it had left scars. Inside the palace walls, the old guard men like Robert Cecil and the Earl of Nottingham paced quietly, trading careful words. They were not just grieving courtiers. They were political survivors already thinking ahead. Who would succeed Elizabeth? James VI of Scotland was the most likely, but nothing was certain until the Queen herself made it so. And Elizabeth, stubborn as ever, hadn't named an heir aloud. That silence hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's refusal to name a successor was a deliberate power play or a sign of her fading faculties. Some say she wanted to keep everyone guessing, to maintain her grip on power, even in her final breath. Others suggest that by the end, she simply didn't care or couldn't. And then there were the personal enemies. Whispers of Catholic plots still flickered through the court. Elizabeth had survived the Babington plot, the Throckmorton plot, the Ridolfi plot, so many schemes to unseat her, to replace her with someone else, usually her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, before Mary lost her head on the block. But paranoia, once planted, rarely dies. There's a peculiar story from these final days, one that feels half-truth, half-spy novel. Supposedly, a man in the shadows, perhaps an agent of a foreign power, had been seen lurking near the palace gates, asking questions, slipping coins to servants for news of the Queen's health. No names were written down, no arrest was made, but the tale lingers like smoke. Could it have been a final attempt to tip the scales to ensure the Tudor line ended once and for all? And let's not forget the Earl of Essex Robert Devereux, the young, dashing nobleman who had once been the Queen's favorite and later her bitter enemy. His execution a few years earlier had left the court divided, and many wondered if his allies might have sought some quiet revenge. Elizabeth's death would have been a poetic twist of fate for them, a final turning of the knife. But there were no arrests, no grand confessions, just the same quiet fear, the same anxious glances, as the Queen's breathing grew slower, the lines on her face deeper. The courtiers watched the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment, an enemy revealed, a plot uncovered. But the only thing that entered was the creeping cold of death, slow and patient, slipping through the tapestries and the velvet, unnoticed by those who had spent years looking for daggers in the dark. Outside, the spring wind rattled the shutters. A bird called once, sharp and lonely, before the quiet swallowed it whole. And inside, Elizabeth England's Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the lioness of a nation, sat, fading into the shadows, surrounded by courtiers who wondered if they were next. The doctors were at a loss, their tools as crude as the guesses they whispered among themselves. In Elizabeth's chamber, the air smelled of herbs and fear, a mix of rosemary, thyme, and the quiet desperation of men who knew they were out of their depth. They tried everything they could think of, though none of it likely helped, and some of it, well, it probably made things worse. Bleeding was an old favorite. They believed that draining a bit of blood would balance the humors, the four mystical fluids they thought governed the body's health. But Elizabeth had no more blood to give, it seemed. Her skin was pale as parchment, her lips dry and cracked. Did they leech her? Perhaps. Leeches were standard, slimy little creatures meant to draw out the bad stuff, though how they knew what was bad remains a mystery. They also tried to warm her up. The theory was that heat could stimulate the vital forces, so they placed hot bricks by her feet, rubbed her hands with warm claws, even wrapped her in layers of blankets. The room, already close and heavy, must have felt like a furnace, and yet she still shivered, her breath shallow, her body barely holding on. And here's a quirky detail that'll make you raise an eyebrow. There are accounts that say one of the doctors tried a curious mixture, a poultice of bread, herbs, and even crushed pearls, applied to her chest in the hopes that the noble material would absorb the sickness. Crushed pearls. Imagine grinding up a fortune in jewels just to see if it might save a queen. Historians still argue whether these treatments prolonged her suffering or if they were the only options her physicians had in a time when medicine was more guesswork than science. Some suggest that her decline was natural, the slow ebb of a life lived hard and long. Others wonder if the very treatments meant to save her might have quickened the end. And let's not forget the power of fear. The doctors knew they were standing on a knife's edge. If the queen died under their care, they might be blamed. If they tried something drastic and it backfired, their heads could end up on the chopping block. So they worked with shaking hands, their voices hushed, glancing nervously at the powerful men in the room. Robert Cecil, the archbishop, the ladies in waiting, each of whom had their own opinions, and none of whom wanted to be held accountable for the queen's demise. The treatments continued. Herbal teas, broths thickened with spices, odd concoctions of vinegar and honey. They even tried mashing up figs, which were thought to have healing properties. But Elizabeth turned her head away, lips pressed tight, refusing to swallow more than a sip here and there. And in the end, none of it mattered. The medicines sat untouched on silver trays. The leeches, if they were used, dropped off her skin, bloated and glistening. The crushed pearls faded into a sticky paste, useless and tragic. The heat of the bricks couldn't push back the cold that had settled in her bones. The doctors looked at one another, eyes wide, faces pale. They whispered, tried again, failed again. The chamber grew quiet, save for the crackling fire and the faint, ragged sound of the queen's breath slipping in and out, slower with each passing hour. And outside the chamber, the world waited. The kingdom held its breath, knowing that when Elizabeth stopped, everything would change. And then there was the matter of the tooth. A toothache, that most human, humble kind of pain, lingered in Elizabeth's final weeks, gnawing at her alongside the weight of years. A queen, yes, but one who couldn't escape the small miseries that come for us all. Elizabeth's teeth had long been the subject of courtly gossip, though no one dared say it too loudly. Years of sugary treats and rich feasts had taken their toll, leaving her with discolored, crumbling teeth and a breath that, let's just say, could clear a room. In those last weeks, some stories claim she suffered from an abscess, an infected tooth festering in her jaw, sending waves of pain through her face and down her neck. Historians still argue whether this toothache could have been the final blow. In an age without antibiotics, an infection like that could spread, slipping quietly from the mouth into the bloodstream, triggering sepsis, that silent killer. A small thing, really a bad tooth, but in a time when even a simple cut could turn deadly, it's not so far-fetched. Here's a quirky little tidbit. Elizabeth was famously terrified of having her teeth treated. There's a tale half true, half dramatized years before. When one of her molars had gone bad, she refused to let the royal dentist pull it. It wasn't until her archbishop himself offered to have one of his own teeth yanked first, to show it wasn't so bad, that she finally relented. The tooth came out, but not without considerable drama. Imagine it, the Queen of England, ruler of seas and armies, shrinking from a dentist's forceps, her courtiers trying not to look too interested. The whole scene both absurd and strangely tender. And so, in those final days, the thought lingers, did the pain in her mouth become too much? Did it wear her down, drip by drip, until the infection seeped deeper, poisoning her body in ways no doctor could fix? We'll never know for certain, but it's a possibility that humbles the whole grand story, doesn't it? While the courtiers whispered about politics and succession, while they debated the next move and the next monarch, Elizabeth herself might have been consumed by a pain so simple, so ordinary, that it could have felled a queen. The irony is sharp, almost cruel. Elizabeth, who had survived assassination plots, political betrayals, even the threat of the Spanish Armada, could have been brought low by a bad tooth. The woman who had outmaneuvered Europe's greatest powers might have been undone by an infection that no one could see, hidden beneath skin and bone. Her face, once so striking, had hollowed in those last weeks. The high cheekbones, the sharp eyes, the quick, knowing smile, they all seemed to fade, leaving behind the waxy stillness of someone waiting. And maybe, in those quiet moments, the ache in her jaw was all she could feel, a dull throb that pulsed in time with the slow, labored rhythm of her breath. Outside the chamber, the bells of London tolled softly. The city hummed with life, unaware that the woman who had led them through so many storms was slipping away, one painful breath at a time. The very things that made Elizabeth a vision of power might have also been quietly killing her. Let's talk about the paint, the powders, the potions she wore like armor, those iconic layers of white makeup and ruby red lips, the rigid ruffs, the jewels draped across her neck. The image of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, wasn't born naturally dot. It was dot, dot, dot applied. And here's the twist. Some of those beauty tools were poison in disguise. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's love of Venetian ceruse, that thick white face paint, a blend of white lead and vinegar, played a part in her decline. Lead, you see, wasn't just bad for your skin. It seeps into your body, into your bones, into your very blood. Imagine smoothing a paste of pure lead across your cheeks every day for decades. It's no wonder Elizabeth's skin turned ghostly, her hair thinned, her teeth blackened, and her body weakened. And then there's mercury. That shimmering, silvery liquid was often used to treat skin blemishes, and Elizabeth, who had survived smallpox early in life, was said to use it to keep her skin smooth. The problem? Mercury is toxic. It attacks the nervous system, damages the kidneys, and can trigger tremors, mood swings, and even madness. Sound familiar? It's almost absurd, isn't it? That the very tools of her image, the flawless white mask, the smooth skin, the polished, perfect look, may have been slowly poisoning her all along. Every morning, as her maids dabbed the thick paint onto her face, as they powdered her neck and painted her lips, they were unknowingly lacing the Queen's body with poison. And here's a quirky detail for you. There's a story that Elizabeth's mirrors were carefully controlled. As her appearance worsened, her ladies would limit how often she saw her own reflection. No one wanted the queen to see the true cost of her image, the thinning hair, the graying skin, the sunken cheeks hidden beneath layers of lead and powder. It's a strange, sad little trick, isn't it? The mirror as a lie, a protection from the truth. Did Elizabeth know what the paint and powders were doing to her? That's part of the mystery. Maybe she suspected but didn't care. Or maybe she thought she could outlast the consequences. After all, she had outlasted everything else, hadn't she? Assassins, traitors, rival queens. Why not a little poison in her makeup? But the body keeps score, and as the years piled up, so did the weight of all those toxins, seeping into her bones, her organs, her blood. In those last days, her skin was paper thin, her body frail, her breath shallow, and perhaps beneath it all, her body was simply breaking under the burden of decades of hidden poison. The irony is almost too much. Elizabeth, the queen who had ruled by image and spectacle, who had crafted her legend so carefully with pearls and portraits and pageants, may have been undone by the very artifice that made her unforgettable. The crown, the jewels, the paint, they were all part of the same performance. Outside, the world moved on. The bells chimed, the streets of London bustled with merchants and traders, and the court whispered behind closed doors. But in that dark chamber, the queen lay propped among her pillows, her skin pale beneath the paint, the weight of time and poison pressing down on her chest with every labored breath. The burden of the crown. Oh, it's easy to imagine a glittering diadem, jewels sparkling in the candlelight, velvet robes trailing behind a monarch who rules with grace and power. But what's harder to picture is the crushing weight of that crown, not the physical object, but the endless choices, the sleepless nights, the quiet knowledge that every decision you make could change the fate of a nation. For Elizabeth, that weight had been pressing down for over 40 years. 4 decades of ruling a kingdom that was constantly on the edge of rebellion, invasion, or ruin. Every morning she rose to a stack of petitions, letters, reports, and the knowledge that someone, somewhere, wanted her dead. It's no wonder that by the end, the strain showed on her face, in her body, and deep in her soul. Historians still argue whether the sheer exhaustion of ruling such a volatile kingdom contributed to her decline. Some say she was worn thin by the constant need to perform, to stay strong, to project an image of unshakable authority. Others believe she thrived on the intrigue, that she relished the chessboard of politics, and that her health faded for more practical reasons, age, disease, and the inevitable toll of time. But think about it. Elizabeth had faced countless threats, from the Spanish Armada to the gunpowder plot conspiracies, and she had to balance them all while keeping her court in check. Her decisions carried consequences that could destroy families, cities, even nations. Every choice had to be weighed, every risk calculated. The weight of that responsibility could break even the strongest soul. And let's not forget the loneliness of it. The Virgin Queen, as she was famously known, had no husband to lean on, no children to share the burden. Her closest advisors, Cecil, Walsingham, Dudley, were trusted, yes, but they were also tools of statecraft, not family. Elizabeth had to guard her heart carefully, never letting it soften too much, always remembering that affection was a risk she couldn't afford. Here's a quirky little detail. Elizabeth often said she was married to her kingdom. It was a clever line, one that played well with her subjects, but it also carried a quiet truth. She had sacrificed love, family, and perhaps even her health for the sake of her throne. And now, as her body weakened, perhaps that crown felt heavier than ever, pressing down until she couldn't lift her head anymore. The decisions she had made, the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, the imprisonment of rivals, the wars and taxes and laws, those choices didn't just vanish. They stayed with her, pressing down like the weight of stones in a pocket. And maybe in those long, silent hours, Elizabeth felt every one of them, each a ghost tugging at her sleeve. Her hands, once steady as she signed proclamations and treaties, now trembled when she lifted them. The fingers that had held the reins of power for so long were thin, the skin stretched tight over the bones. Her breath came shallow, her eyes heavy-lidded. And still the crown waited nearby, its silent gleam a reminder of all she had borne. Outside, the world turned on. Merchants shouted in the streets, bells tolled, horses clattered down cobbled lanes. But inside that dark chamber, time seemed to stretch, the moments thick with memory and the unseen weight of a lifetime spent balancing duty and desire. And perhaps, in the end, it wasn't any one sickness, any one plot, or any one poison that claimed her life. Perhaps it was simply the burden of the crown itself, a weight too heavy for any mortal to carry forever. In her final days, Elizabeth's chamber at Richmond Palace became a place of quiet vigil. The once vibrant queen, known for her sharp wit and commanding presence, now lay silent, her strength waning. Those closest to her gathered, their faces etched with concern and sorrow. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, stood by her side, offering prayers and comfort. Elizabeth, though weak, responded with slight nods, her eyes reflecting a deep sense of peace. She had faced many challenges in her life, but now she seemed ready to rest. On March 24, 1603, in the early hours, Elizabeth I passed away. Her death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of a new era under James VI of Scotland. The transition was smooth, a testament to the careful planning and the respect she commanded. Elizabeth's body was taken to Whitehall Palace, where it lay in state for several weeks. Mourners from all walks of life came to pay their respects, honoring the Queen, who had led them through a golden age. Her funeral procession was a grand affair, reflecting the nation's deep admiration and grief. She was interred in Westminster Abbey, in a tomb she shares with her half-sister Mary I. The inscription on their tomb reads, "Partners both in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection." Elizabeth's legacy endures, her reign marked by exploration, cultural flourishing, and relative peace left an indelible mark on England. Though her final days were quiet, the impact of her life continues to resonate through history. The watchers thought they were always there, a quiet, constant presence. Elizabeth's chamber, once filled with music and debate, had transformed into a waiting room for history. The courtiers, the doctors, the ladies-in-waiting, each one of them standing in the dim light, holding their breath, watching their queen. And yet no one really knew what to say. They hovered at the edges of her world, eyes darting, hands twisting nervously in their laps. They whispered prayers under their breath, exchanged careful glances, and tried to pretend they weren't watching a monarch slowly slipping away. It was a strange kind of vigil, half reverent, half anxious. Historians still argue whether those in the room were truly there for her, or for themselves. Some say they stayed out of loyalty, to comfort the queen in her final hours. Others suggest they lingered to be the first to know, to secure their positions in the chaos that might follow. After all, when the Queen of England dies, the world shifts and fortunes are made or lost overnight. Here's a peculiar little detail. Elizabeth refused to have a full deathbed audience. She allowed only a small, trusted circle to stay in her chamber as her breath grew shallow. Among them were Robert Cecil, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and a few of her most loyal ladies. Even as her strength faded, she controlled the room, choosing who could bear witness to the end of an era. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards, the crackle of the fire, and the occasional sound of her labored breathing. The courtiers shifted from foot to foot, pretending not to look too long at the woman who had been their sovereign, their symbol, their sometimes terrifying ruler. And as the minutes turned to hours, the days to nights, the watchers did what they could. They fluffed the pillows, dabbed her forehead with cool cloths, adjusted the heavy curtains to block the light. They murmured soft prayers, unsure if she heard, unsure if it mattered. Outside the chamber, the palace was a quiet storm. Servants hurried through the halls, ministers gathered in whispered conferences, and the great wheels of state began to turn slowly, hesitantly. No one dared to make a move until the queen had truly passed, but the world was already preparing for what came next. And in the room, the watchers stayed. They stayed because they had to. They stayed because leaving would have meant acknowledging the end. They stayed because they were afraid of what might happen when the breath finally stopped. Elizabeth, for her part, seemed both there and not there. Her eyes fluttered open at times, unfocused and distant. Her fingers twitched occasionally, as if reaching for something unseen. Did she know they were there? Did she care? No one can say. The hours stretched endlessly, each one heavy with the weight of unspoken words. The watchers barely spoke, barely moved, trapped between their duty to the queen and their own racing thoughts. And still the room held its breath. The fire burned low. The candles flickered. The queen lay still, and the watchers watched. Her final words, that's the detail that lingers in the air, isn't it? The last breath, the final whisper, the moment when a queen's voice falls silent forever. What did Elizabeth I, the monarch who had ruled with such fierce determination, say at the end? Did she offer a grand statement, a command, a farewell worthy of a legend? Or was it something simple or quieter, more human, more ordinary? Historians still argue whether her last words were ever truly recorded, or if they've been lost to time, replaced by legend. Some accounts say she spoke the word remember before falling silent, a hauntingly vague message that has sparked centuries of speculation. Remember what, exactly? Her reign? Her legacy? The lessons of her life? Others claim she muttered, "I am the Queen of England still," a defiant last stand that feels almost too perfect, too cinematic to be real. Could she really have gathered the strength for such a statement when her body was so frail and her breath so shallow? Maybe. Elizabeth had always been one for a dramatic exit. And then there's a softer, stranger account that she whispered a prayer, or simply the name of her late father, Henry VIII, or perhaps Robert Dudley, the great love of her life. Or maybe it was just a sigh, a barely there breath, no words at all, just a quiet exhale, the sound of a woman finally letting go after a lifetime of holding everything together. Here's a quirky little tidbit. In some versions of the story, the last thing she asked for was the ring she had always worn, the one with her mother's portrait inside. Did she clutch it in those final moments, the tiny locket warm against her skin? Or did it simply lie nearby, a silent witness to her passing? The details blur, shifting like fog, impossible to pin down. The room was still. The fire, low and crackling, barely warmed the air. Her ladies in waiting, standing by her bed, held their breath, waiting for a sound, a word, a sign that she was still with them. The Archbishop of Canterbury leaned close, whispering prayers, his voice steady and soft. But Elizabeth's lips barely moved. Her breath grew slower, thinner, like the last flickers of a dying candle. And then it stopped. No great proclamation, no thunderous final command, just the quiet slipping away of a life that had loomed so large for so long. In the silence that followed, her watchers wept, some quietly, some openly, as the weight of the moment settled on their shoulders. The Virgin Queen, the last of the Tudors, was gone. The woman who had danced at court, defied popes and kings, outlived conspirators and lovers alike, had breathed her last. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing heavy with loss. Outside, the world turned, unaware that a chapter had just closed. Inside, the courtiers bowed their heads, the ladies wept softly into their sleeves, and the crown waited. Her final words, if they were ever spoken at all, hung in the air, half heard, half imagined, fading into the silence of history. The body of the Queen, what it revealed, or perhaps more importantly, what it didn't. That's where the whispers begin, the questions hang, and the debates spin endlessly. When Elizabeth I's long, remarkable life finally slipped away, her stillness left behind a strange kind of puzzle. Her body lay there, quiet, unmoving, while the courtiers hovered in the dim light, not quite ready to believe it was truly over. The great golden age of England ended. And yet, the Queen's body didn't show the dramatic signs they might have expected. There was no obvious wound, no rash of spots or sores, no dark, visible rot. She simply faded. Historians still argue whether an autopsy was performed. Some sources suggest her body was examined, that doctors quietly tried to understand what had claimed her. Others say no, that the Queen's dignity was protected, her body left undisturbed as a matter of respect and royal tradition. The truth, like so much of her life, is shrouded in shadows. And then there's this peculiar little tidbit. Elizabeth's body was said to have been so frail by the end, so thin and delicate that the courtiers were afraid it might not hold together when they tried to move her. They wrapped her in layers of linen and velvet, and the royal herald spoke of her in hushed, reverent tones, careful to keep her image as intact in death as it had been in life. The physical signs of her decline: pale skin, thinning hair, a hint of swelling in her legs, those were the small human marks of age and wear. Nothing dramatic. No twisted signs of poison. No gruesome injuries, just a body done. And yet, even in death, the mystery lingered. Was it pneumonia? A stroke? Cancer? Perhaps? Or had the long years of lead-laced cosmetics and mercury-based treatments finally taken their toll? Did the pain in her jaw, that old infected tooth, have a role? The quiet consensus, if there is such a thing, leans toward natural causes, the slow, grinding decline of an aging body battered by decades of stress, sickness, and sorrow. But there are those who wonder if Elizabeth had allowed more medical intervention, if she had accepted stronger treatments, would the story have been different? Could she have lingered longer? Or was her body simply done, no matter what they tried? Her face, so carefully painted for so many years, was left bare in death. The white lid, the crimson lips, the powdered brows all gone. Her real face, the one hidden beneath the masks of power, was finally revealed, pale, gaunt, deeply lined. A face that had seen nearly 70 winters, that had smiled and scowled and suffered and survived. And perhaps that's the most poignant part. Elizabeth's body, in the end, told the story of a woman who had given everything, her health, her youth, her peace of mind, for the crown. No dramatic cause of death, no scandalous reveal. Just the quiet truth of a life lived hard and long. Outside the chamber, the bells began to toll. The kingdom stirred, the news spread, and the body of the queen, carefully wrapped and prepared, waited to begin the long journey to Westminster. The watchers stepped back, the candles flickered, and Elizabeth, her body now still, her secrets slipping into legend, rested. The aftermath of Elizabeth's death rippled outward like a slow, heavy wave. At first, the palace itself seemed to hold its breath. The courtiers, the servants, even the walls and windows, it was as if the entire place had been waiting for this moment, and now that it had arrived, no one quite knew what to do next. The news spread carefully at first, carried on hushed voices and cautious steps. The Queen was dead. The Queen was dead. The Queen, who had ruled for 44 years, who had seen off the Spanish Armada, who had been both adored and feared, was gone. Historians still argue whether the reaction across England was one of relief or sorrow. Some say the people had long been ready for a change, eager for a new ruler who might bring fresh energy and ideas. Others say Elizabeth's death left a hole that couldn't be filled, that the country mourned the passing of an icon. But there's no debate about the pageantry that followed. Elizabeth's funeral was a spectacle like no other, a grand procession that wound through the streets of London, with thousands watching. Her coffin, draped in rich fabrics and topped with a lifelike effigy of the Queen herself, was borne by white horses, their manes braided with black ribbons. The streets were lined with mourners, some weeping openly, others standing in quiet awe, hats in hand. And here's a quirky detail. Elizabeth's body was so carefully prepared that she lay in state for weeks, without showing the usual signs of decay. The embalming methods of the time weren't exactly advanced, so it's likely that a heavy dose of perfumes, spices, and cold weather helped preserve her. Whatever the reason, the public marveled at how lifelike the Queen appeared, even in death. Myths and rumors bloomed in the days and weeks that followed. Some whispered that Elizabeth had never truly died, that she had been replaced by a double, or that her spirit still walked the halls of the palace. Others spun stories of secret messages hidden in her funeral effigy, codes left for those loyal to her memory. And of course there were those who said she had been poisoned after all, that enemies, foreign or domestic, had finally found a way to silence her. The truth, as always, was simpler and sadder. Elizabeth had lived a long, hard life, and it had simply worn her down. James VI of Scotland was proclaimed King James I of England without much fuss. The transition, surprisingly smooth for such a momentous change, was a testament to how carefully the Queen and her council had managed her final days. Still, it was strange for the people of England. The Tudor dynasty, so long a part of their world, was gone. The Elizabethan age had ended. And yet, the image of Elizabeth, the queen in pearls, in the rough, with her sharp eyes and imperious bearing, remained fixed in the minds of her people. Even in death, she was a symbol, a legend, a figure larger than life. Her passing didn't erase her. It immortalized her. The bells tolled for her funeral. The choir sang. The streets were hushed, the air heavy with the scent of incense and damp spring earth. And as the coffin was lowered into the ground at Westminster Abbey, next to her half-sister Mary, the watchers bowed their heads, the candles flickered, and the nation quietly turned the page. The legacy of an enigma, that's what Elizabeth left behind. Hers was a life carved in contradictions. The virgin queen who ruled with a mother's fierce devotion. The master of pageantry who carried a quiet, private grace. The ruler who held a kingdom together but left no clear heir to inherit her vision. Even now, historians still argue whether Elizabeth's reign was a golden age or a glittering facade. Did she truly strengthen England, or did she simply hold the nation together by sheer force of will until her death forced a reckoning? Some say she was a masterful politician, playing rival factions like a lute and keeping the country at peace when war loomed on every side. Others whisper that her refusal to marry or name a successor left the kingdom vulnerable, a ticking clock that finally ran out when her breath did. And then there's the personal legacy. Elizabeth, as a woman, shattered expectations. In a world where women were supposed to marry, bear children, and fade into the background, she stood alone, commanding armies, signing treaties, and holding her ground against men who underestimated her at every turn. She showed the world that a woman could rule without a husband, without a king by her side, and not just rule, but thrive. But that independence came at a cost. Her court was a tightrope of flirtations and alliances, her personal life a tangle of affections she could never fully embrace. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, men who were more than friends, less than lovers, and always second to her crown. Historians still debate that, too. Here's a quirky little thread. Elizabeth once famously declared that she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king. It's a line that echoes through history, a challenge thrown at the doubters, and a shield she wore to the end. But imagine the weight of that, the constant need to prove herself, to perform, to never let her guard down. That pressure could crack the strongest of minds and bodies. And yet Elizabeth became an icon, her image stamped onto coins, painted in portraits, woven into the very fabric of English history. Gloriana, the fairy queen, the ruler who defied the Spanish Armada, who inspired poets and explorers who saw England through its own Renaissance. Her legend grew larger than her life, larger than the truth, larger than any single moment in that quiet, darkened chamber at Richmond. Her death did not diminish her. If anything, it elevated her. The Virgin Queen, gone, but not really. Her policies, her style of rule, her fierce independence, all of it left a mark on the world that rippled far beyond her lifetime. In the centuries since, she's been cast as everything from a hero to a tyrant, a feminist icon to a lonely, calculating manipulator. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the murky middle. Elizabeth was a queen, yes, but also a woman full of contradictions, capable of tenderness and cruelty, strength and weakness, brilliance and stubborn blindness. Her death left questions, mysteries that historians still pick over like bones at a feast. Was she poisoned? Did she simply wear herself down? Could more have been done to save her? But those questions pale in comparison to the legacy she left. A woman who ruled, who endured, who became a legend. The image remains. Elizabeth in her ruff, her red wig towering, her pale face powdered into an almost ghostly mask, one hand resting on the globe, the other on her sword. A queen, a crown, and a mystery that endures. Could it have been prevented? That's the haunting question that circles like a slow, restless wind around the story of Elizabeth's death. With all the knowledge we have now, with centuries of hindsight and modern medicine, we can't help but wonder, was there a moment, a choice, a remedy that could have saved the Queen? Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's death was inevitable, a quiet unraveling of a body pushed beyond its limits, or if a different path might have been possible. Could more aggressive medical treatments have helped? Could a better understanding of infection have saved her from that possible toothache-turned sepsis? Could someone have convinced her to lie down and rest before her body gave up the fight? And then there's the harder, deeper truth. Elizabeth was more than just a body. She was a queen, a symbol, a story. And for someone like her, someone who had ruled through sheer force of will for decades, who had shaped her image into a kind of living myth, letting go wasn't just a physical act. It was an undoing of everything she had built. Maybe, in a strange way, she knew that. Maybe that's why she refused food, refused sleep, refused to lie down. Maybe it wasn't just illness or age that claimed her, but the slow, stubborn decision to leave the stage on her own terms. After all, when you've ruled for 44 years, seen off threats from within and without, and held a nation together, it's hard to let anyone else have the final say. Here's a quirky little thought. Some historians believe that Elizabeth might have lingered longer if she had allowed herself to show weakness, to accept care more readily, to let her body rest and heal. But that was never her way. She wasn't a queen who leaned on others. She was the queen who ruled alone. And maybe that's the real lesson her death leaves us with. Sometimes strength becomes a cage. The very willpower that helps you survive can, in the end, become the thing that breaks you. Elizabeth's legacy is a shining one, yes, but it's also a reminder of the cost of power, of what happens when a person, no matter how fierce, how determined, how regal, pushes too hard for too long. Her story echoes through time, whispered in classrooms, debated in books, and imagined in countless films and dramas. We see her painted in pearls and velvet, staring down enemies, charming ambassadors, inspiring poets. We see her as the icon she became, but it's easy to forget the woman beneath the crown, the one who hurt, who loved, who sometimes made the wrong choice. Could her death have been prevented? Maybe, maybe not. But in the end, perhaps it wasn't about whether she could have lived a little longer. Perhaps it was about the fact that she had lived truly, lived more boldly and more fiercely than anyone could have expected. And when it was time to go, she went out on her own terms, as she had done everything else. And so the story fades into silence. The candles burn low. The watchers step away. The world moves on, but the memory of the Virgin Queen remains, a quiet, enduring echo across the centuries. Now, let's take a breath together, shall we? As the story winds down, the flickering candlelight softens. The sound of distant footsteps fades into the quiet hum of the world at rest. The grand chambers, once filled with whispers and worries, fall still. Outside, the air cools, the stars blink gently in the sky, and the weight of history settles like a soft blanket. Take a slow breath. Let the story melt into the background, the questions and debates fading into a gentle hush. The tale of Elizabeth, with all its twists and turns, is just one thread in the endless tapestry of time. And now it's time to let it go, to close the book for tonight. Rest your eyes. Let your body sink into the softness around you. The Queen's story is at peace now, her crown resting quietly in the halls of memory. Sleep well, dream of far-off times and glimmering crowns, and know that tomorrow is a new day, full of its own stories waiting to be told. Sweet dreams.